This is Nick Mueller, your writing mentor for English 105. Today I'm going to talk to you about the peer review for Project 2. And before we get into the question by question breakdown, I'm going to talk about, again, the rationale. Peer reviews for Projects 1, 2, and the multimodal portfolio help to replicate in their own way the classroom conversation that you might have in a traditional classroom. So it's very important that you participate in these. If for some reason there's going to be a delay, please let your instructor or myself know. And when you do these, do not one and a half, but 2 peer reviews for your peers. Let's see. And when you do your peer reviews, please try to focus on the work. It's easier to say, you could have done this, you could have done that, you did well here, you did well there, but we want to make these peer reviews about the work since they are about Project 2, not, for instance, peer review worksheet for Nancy Ann. So keep the focus on the work, and as you may have noticed, we're more focused on the big picture issues than we are on things like grammar errors. So keep the focus on genre, on evidence, on the prompts themselves. And also, there's this interesting finding about fairness. When it comes to fairness, believe it or not, we want a ratio of about 6 to 1. So if at all possible, keep it fair. And by keeping it more positive than negative, even if you are keeping your comments focused on the work. Specificity, just like when you're writing your Project 1 or Project 2, provide evidence for the claims you're making, and whenever possible, quote from your peers' work so you can support what you're saying and give them an idea of where they need to focus. So right now I'm going to walk through this worksheet item by item to give you an idea of how to approach it. Okay, so prompts for number 1. Did the title and first few sentences clearly introduce the proposal? Well, this is important because we want to get our readers hooked early on, right? Just like if it were just the enticing start of a novel, we want to get them hooked in some way. Sometimes that's by beginning in the middle of the action. Sometimes that's beginning with an interesting fact or figure or quote you got from one of your research sources. There are a lot of different ways to write a hook. So focus on hooking your readers, your audience. Some common issues here are too general or generic a title. The title doesn't coincide enough or feature the group enough or the community issue you're concerned with for Project 2. Going on to prompt 2, does the essay have a clearly identified audience? You can check out the audience identification tool in the modules over here in Canvas to help you with this. Part of figuring out who the audience is looking at where the problem in the community is occurring. Is it in Dallas-Fort Worth, or is it some broader nationwide problem? We're trying to keep the focus on a local issue in a community, so the locality can tell you a lot. The population or populations affected by the problem or issue in the community can help. And again, how do you know? How do you know is consider this an invitation to cite evidence, cite specific text from your peers' Project 2 draft. Prompt number 3, does the writer clearly identify the problem and demonstrate a need for change in the introduction? In other words, do they define the problem and present the solution in short order? Does one follow right after the other? So going back to number 1, we want to have a way to hook our audience early on and follow that up with the statement of the problem and then demonstrate that there's a need for this problem in the introduction. So that's all in your first paragraph. So if your peer doesn't do that, try to target why specifically that might not be. What is the problem? Again, this is an invitation to quote from your peer. Is it believable? Well, believability is very, very subjective, of course. So if the problem is one that occurs somewhere you've never ever been, like I've never really spent time in Colorado, that might make things a little bit more difficult for me, since I don't know the terrain, I don't know what the people are like necessarily, in Boulder, for instance, or Denver. So believability also often comes from specific details, sensory details, specifics about what make the problem a problem in the community, whether it's citywide, countywide, or part of a problem in the ecosystem brought about by industrial issues or commonplace urban sprawl. It's in the details. That's where the believability tends to come from. So when we look at the question, how could the author be more convincing, consider what details would bring you into the scene so that you can picture it to yourself, so you can experience it in your imagination. Question, or prompt 5. Does the essay propose a workable, realistic, well thought out solution? Yeah, if it requires a lot of different moving parts, that may indicate that there are gaps where problems could happen that make the solution less than workable. Is it extremely costly? That might not be realistic. For instance, solving issues related to education in Arizona, which ranks 48th or 49th in the nation, education, unless there's going to be significant money incoming to solve the issues, the solution is unlikely to be realistic. Well thought out, if it's a big long-term problem in the community, is a short-term fix going to get it done? Probably not. So sometimes a solution means thinking of both the short-term and the long-term, and again, the believability of the solution comes from the details as well as the big picture view that solution takes. Why or why not? Again, this is an invitation to quote from your peer's text. Question 6, does the essay demonstrate sound reasoning and logic? And then, does the author support his or her proposal with documentation from research secondary sources? Why or why not? Again, this is fairly straightforward compared to this question, this first question, so I'm going to focus on this first question here. Sound reasoning and logic. I think the easiest way to spot whether there's sound reasoning and logic is to see whether there are gaps. And these gaps in reasoning and logic are often, in my experience, more apparent when you read your work or your peer's work, anyone's work aloud. That's where the gaps tend to show up, because the sound and the sense of what's been conveyed by the author, whether it's you, whether it's your peer, whether it's a published writer, tend to become more apparent. Does the author discuss alternative solutions? This is yes or no, the light switch is on or it's off. Are they feasible or not? Feasibility, again, like believability and the workability above, those come from the details. Do the details and the short term coincide with the big picture that the author is looking at? Again, here's an invitation to tell your peer what else they could look at and to help them out with specific suggestions. 8 proceeds naturally from item 7 above. Does the author include 2 or 3 counter arguments? So this might be a helpful time to look back at the counter arguments discussion board to see if your peers' counter arguments have developed since they initially began thinking of them. Here's the invitation to quote from your peer's text. Are they well refuted? What does well refuted mean? Again, it means believability. Are there specific details that does the author show in context how these other possibilities wouldn't work given the money available, the time available, the groups who are interested in solving the problem within the community? Is the call to action clear, and does it motivate the reader toward action? Why or why not? Okay, the call to action is going to come toward the later parts of the project to submission. The call to action is a lot more pathos oriented. It's a lot more emotionally bound. So the question here is, does this call to action move you? Does it stir any feeling in you, or is it just like intellectually, yeah, I think, in Arizona it would be good to have a stronger education system that helps the young people. Does it affect you emotionally? If the answer to that is no, ask yourself what would, and then provide a specific suggestion or suggestions for your peer that draws upon the earlier parts of their text, the earlier evidence they provide, the narrative they tell about that problem in the community. Does the author provide in-text documentation? Again, yes or no, if the light switch is on or off. If you've got questions about APA, by all means, reach out to your instructor, reach out to your writing mentor, reach out even to a writing center that's available for you at ASU. After reviewing the PSA or advocacy ad, what stands out to you the most? Again, this could be intellectual, it could be emotional, it's just what grabs you immediately. It might not make sense, it might be something different from what the author intends. Nonetheless, it's worth bringing up because it's a way you can help out your peer wherever they are, whether in the same state or whether they're off in Italy. This is part of replicating or creating a virtual classroom conversation. What is unique? Well, unique is, again, very subjective. That's a neutral way of saying, what do you like the most about this? Could be the color palette, could be the font selected, could be something funny about the PSA or advocacy ad. For the third part of 11, does it have the visual design and rhetorical characteristics? This is a fancy way of saying, does it meet the conventions of this genre or this genre? And you might have a pretty good idea of these from your experience in the relevant discussion board. If not, you can always go back and look at what your peers had to say, especially the peers you admire for being really on their game. You can look at what they have to say about visual design and about rhetorical characteristics. And oftentimes the PSA or advocacy ad says something that the text of Project 2 cannot. That's why we're placing these genres together with one another. The image from the advocacy ad might say something or reach the audience in a way that the text cannot. So think about what the PSA or advocacy ad is doing in that regard, or could be doing. And again, try to be specific to help your peers out. Number 12, does the ad demonstrate technical quality? Are they concerned with readability, with audibility, and viewability? Are the parts, is there enough separation between the parts of the design? Is it too busy? Does the warmth or coldness of the color palette make sense given the topic being addressed? And looking at the design holistically, is there completeness? Is there a harmony among the parts of the design? Again, uniqueness, very subjective. What hits you immediately about your peers' work? 13, audience. And you can refer back up to the earlier question about audience and see where there might be overlap between the PSA or advocacy ad and your peers' rough draft for Project 2. Because where there's overlap and when there is not overlap can tell you about whether your peer is essentially on message in what they've written. Again, there's another way to check the two things I just mentioned. Does it correspond to the purpose stated in the introduction and the call to action? So there are fourfold ways to check these things against each other. Does the purpose check out with the call to action? The purpose is more of a logical appeal with a bit of ethos mixed in, right? The The call to action is pathos. Are those synced up? Okay, those are on the text, right? And are those two in turn synced up with how the audience is addressed in the PSA or advocacy ad? If the answer is yes, then congratulate your peer. They've done something pretty impressive there. If not, if there's some shortfall, if there's some gaps, alert your peer to what those are. 14, does the PSA or advocacy ad briefly demonstrate the problem, illustrate the solution, and provide justification for that solution? If not, what elements need to be improved upon? Again, the text of your peer submission can be useful for checking these things, because like that very early question in this peer review worksheet asks you to do, your peer is supposed to state the problem and explain why there's a need for a solution to that problem and what that solution might be. So checking out the introduction of the text your peer has written could be a great way to check out the information here if you're uncertain. Again, please be specific. Nearing the end here almost. 15, does the PSA or advocacy ad grab the audience's attention and inform them about the proposal? This is the equivalent of the hook your audience early on that we mentioned. I believe it was question 1 of this worksheet. Does it happen or doesn't it? And if it grabs you, it probably grabs you in an emotional way. So think of how if the PSA or advocacy ad isn't grabbing you in an emotional way, what would be the way to accomplish that with the minimum amount of changes in the design your peers offered, or in the text within that design? Is there some gap in between the text written and the design, or is it more of the design itself that's preventing you from being grabbed? All right. 16, global issues. What the heck is that, you ask? That's first year composition speak for the big picture issues I mentioned earlier: evidence, genre, citations, the paragraph by paragraph organization, how those paragraphs relate to one another logically or not. Keep it focused on the big picture, right? All right, that's it for me. I hope you at least got some help out of this overview of the Project 2 peer review. By all means, let me know by email if I could have done something better, or in the comments. All right, thank you very much.